recording. So we're gonna add authentication to Shay's project. So he's built in already support for profiles, and his main app has a beginning of a login page. We'll probably end up changing this a little bit because we're probably not going to do username and password login. We're just going to do, you'll probably just end up with a welcome to my app and a button for login. And we'll see that when we get there. But we're ready to add this so that we work with authentication. So like I said, in the handbook, there's a guide. I'm going to be editing that as we go. But one of the first things we're going to end up doing is signing up for an account at auth0.com. I've already created my account. I ended up just logging in and signing up with my GitHub account. So I'm actually using my GitHub account to log into my auth0 account, which allows me to log in to apps with other things. But you'll create an account. And one of the things I'll ask you to do is create a create a domain, not a domain name, but like a name for yourself. I called mine G-Stark. You'd probably call yours something like your name, maybe the same as your GitHub name. But when you log in, you'll eventually get something like this. You'll create an account. And what you'll do is you'll make a new application. So I'm going to create a new application, and I'm going to call it Shay Capstone. And you'll probably want to create a new application for each of the apps you end up deploying. So you'll want one for your Capstone, and if you deploy a new application, you'll want a separate app for that. And I'll show you why in a minute it's going to be true. So you create a Shay Capstone, and we're going to choose single page web app. This I know I have in the right. You're going to log into auth0. You'll be asked to choose a domain name. We're going to create an application and choose an application name and choose single page web app as the application type. And we'll create this. Right. It does have some quick start guides in here, but we kind of have our own. So you're welcome to read through these if you'd like. But the most important thing in here is inside of the settings, we have a couple things. We have a client ID and a client secret. For our purposes, we really only need this client ID. We're going to need this crazy number here in a minute. You're all going to get your own for your own app. So when Shay creates his for his Capstone project, he'll get a different client ID. This one happens to be mine. Notice my domain is gstark.auth0.com. Yours will be different. What we want to do is a couple things. We're going to come down here, and in allowed callback URLs, we are going to add HTTP localhost 3000 in there. Oops. HTTP localhost 3000. When you get to deployment, you're going to add a second one that's going to be HTTPS, whatever your app name is, app name, blah, 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 tacos, right, unique to you, .herokuapp.com eventually, once we deploy this. But in the beginning, the only site we're going to allow to use auth0 is our local host. But eventually you're going to add your production host as well. Right? I don't know what my production host is yet. You may not know what yours is yet. If you do, great, and add it in. If you don't, we're just going to leave HTTP localhost 3000. and we will save this. I'm going to leave this open because eventually I'm going to need to come back and get this client ID part. Right, make note of your domain and your client ID values. These are the two things we'll need to know. We'll need to know this domain, and we'll need to know this client ID, because that's how we're going to tell auth0 in our React app who we are and what app we are. So let's integrate auth0 to the front end first. We're going to do that by inside of the client folder. We're going to yarn add auth0.js. So inside of our client folder, we will add the auth0 library to our React app. Now our React app, just like we have Axios and React Router, one of the bits of code we'll be able to use is the auth0 code. And that adds a library for us to talk to auth0, which sets up our authentication. So let's restart yarn start if we need to. Let me put a note about that. Okay, so now we need to add some of our own code in order to work with the auth0 library. Right? Just like when we brought in Axios to replace the fetch API, we have to use Axios in a specific way. So I've added the boilerplate for that. So in our, in our source directory, in our client source directory, we're going to add a file called auth.js. And this is going to be all the code that deals with working with the auth0 library, logging users in, logging users out, getting their profiles, all of that. And I have the boilerplate for that in the guide. So I'm just going to copy it. Oh, there's a boilerplate. Look at all that. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to add it here as auth.js. And you'll notice at the top there are two constants, one for the domain and one for the client ID. The domain is gstark, and the client ID is going to be, for me, this number right here, this string right here. So I'm going to copy mine and paste it in here. Client ID. Did I copy the secret? Thanks. I meant to click on this one. Client ID. Yeah, cool. Thank you. The client ID. What's it complaining about this? So if we look at what's in here, right, we have a setup that connects us to auth0 and authenticates us with auth0. We have a constructor that sets up some login, logout, handle authentication, is authenticated functions. And then this code gives us methods to call to log a user in, to log a user out. We'll talk about handle authentication in a minute, what it does. It gives us an is authenticated method that tells us if this user is logged in or not logged in. So if part of your application is only usable if the user is logged in, we can use this method to say, well, if they're not authenticated, send them back to the login page. Right? So if there are parts of your application that you don't want a user to have access to, in that component will mount, we can check if the user is authenticated, and if they're not, send them back to the login page. Right? That way they can't hop into your app past the login page. And then these parts here are kind of the technical bits of how we get access tokens. We talked about, when we talked about the OAuth part, that idea of that access token. And we're going to talk about the authorization header in a minute. So this code just kind of sets up some boilerplate for us to work with auth0. We would put in our domain and our client ID at the top. The next thing we need is a file to work with history. We're going to change the way we work with the browser history a little bit when we get to a router. So we need to create, also in the source directory here, a file called history.js. And it just contains these 2 lines. Right. Now we're at the part where we can start working with the router. We have our auth0 set up. We have a little bit of boilerplate to code to work with auth0. So now we can start working with router to get to the point where we can see if a user is logged in. So let's go see if we can figure out where Shay's router component is. Let's see if it's in app. It is, perfect. So here's his router and all of his routes that go to the different components. What we need to do at the top is add these imports and get access to the auth component. So at the very top, we will import auth from auth and import history from history. And then we're going to create a new constant called auth lowercase. That's a new instance of the auth class that we got from the auth component. So this is going to handle authentication. This is going to handle history. And then this auth variable will let us get access to that authorization information. So we'll import these 2 things and create this constant. So we need the auth component to allow the user to log in, log out, and access profile information. The history object will allow us to provide history to the router and modify that history as necessary. Because we're going to be modifying the history in a slightly different way, we're going to change from using browser router to simple router and provide a custom history object to it. Right? So this is going to be slightly different than how we did it before we had authentication. So we're going to come back here and we're going to change this to not be browser router as router. We're just going to import plain old router, the plain built-in router. And then in our render function where we have router, we're going to change that to say router history. The history for this router is the history that we imported here. So down below where your router is, we're going to say the history for this router, the history prop for this router is the history that we imported from that library. Right? And this is going to give us the ability to modify this history in a very specific way. It's a small change from how we were dealing with browser router. So now we have the ability to have a couple of different routes in our app that deal with login and logout, and we'll talk about what callback is in a second. So let's add these 2 routes first. So let's add these 2 routes first. So Shay already kind of has a component for sign-in. Probably what will end up happening is we probably won't end up using those. Oh, did we not restart Yarn? Oh, I forgot to answer the question. Yes. Now it's running. So let's take a look and see what his sign-in /sign-in looks like. And if we're going to end up using that. We may not. Come on, Yarn. Start. Yarn, start. Yarn, start. Yeah. Yep. Okay, here we go. Cool. So your sign in is pretty much just like your homepage. Okay. But you'll notice now we have some paths here. This is kind of the first time we've seen this render. So when we don't have a specific component to use, we can give the route a render function. And as long as that render function renders something or redirects us, we'll do what that function says. And here I'm just using a small inline function to say, when you go to /login, you should call that auth object's login function. Right? And auth is our auth.js. Login just calls this.auth0 authorize. So if we call auth.login, we'll be asking our app to log us in to auth0. And if we call logout, that will be logging us out. So let's just try sticking /login here. And what we should get is, oops, yeah, there's a little mistake. /callback is what we need. So back in our application settings, this needs to be /callback. Let's make that change in the, this here should be /callback. Let's fix that and save it. And let's try logging in again. So localhost 3001 /login. Oh, and it's 3001 callback. Let's try it one more time. Localhost 3001 login. So what this will do is you'll see it's taking us to auth0, and hopefully this time it'll give us a sign in. There we go. And it's asking me to sign in with Google or for me to create an account on auth0. Right? So I'm going to authorize Shay's capstone to log me in with Google. Since I have multiple Google accounts, it's going to ask me which Google account do I want. Now I'm at Google authenticating, which is going to take me back to auth0 and say, hey, do you really want to authorize the app Shay Capstone? Right? And it's asking me that it's going to have access to my profile and my email. And we'll see the different things we can ask for later. Right? This is that, we talked about that OAuth process of it passing the tokens back and forth and the grant. Now I'm at the stage where it's asking me to grant a connection between my personal my personal Google account and Shay's capstone running on my local machine. I'll say sure. And now it takes me back to Shay's application, but look at where it took me back to. It took me back to a URL that says callback access token equals blah, 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 right? It passes back this access token. This is that JWT object we talked about before. This whole long, crazy number that has all this data encoded inside of it. This whole long thing that keeps scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. If we look at the very beginning of this, we need a route in our application that deals with this callback that processes that information. So that was the last part of the path I did not copy.
If someone happened to copy paste that, could they log into your account?
They could not, because it's generated just for you, just for that one interaction. So it's expecting a callback to this app that was generated. So there's like a handshake that goes back and forth. Right. So there's no what we call a replay attack where you can reuse that same token. So here's a little bit of code for the route for the callback. So this /callback will call the auths object handle authentication. And if we look at what handle authentication does here, this does all of the parsing of the hash and the access token and the ID token. It calls set session on the auth object and sends us back to our home page. Right? So this handle authentication that we get through the callback tells our front end to record some information about what auth0 told us and send us back to the home page. So let's take a look at what setSession does. setSession figures out a expiry time, and it gets from the result an access token and an ID token and puts them into local storage. Right? We talked very briefly about local storage being this like key value store that your browser has. This is how the browser will remember, even if I close the browser page and reopen it, this data is stored in the browser storage, so it remembers my token, my access token and my ID token, as well as this expiry time. So now it knows who I am. If, for instance, I put in the render here, a console.log is the user authenticated, I can call auth.isAuthenticated. And this should give me a true or a false if the user is authenticated or not. So let's see what happens if I reload this page. So we're in my console. Let's see how clean our console. Is the user authenticated is true. If I go to /logout, nothing was returned from the render. Let's see if we reload the page. That may be a mistake in our, okay. That's probably a thing to fix. But here it says the user is authenticated as false, right? But if I then come through and log in, sign in, yes. Bounces me around a couple times to Google. I'm going to log in as this person again. It logs me back in. When I finally land on this page, why does it say false? Reload the page. Is authenticated user is true. This is what we're looking for. I don't know why it said false there the first time. That's something to look into. But this is the flow through logging in and logging out. I think the logout is that in the auth, let's look at the logout. What does it do? Aha. So this probably does not finish the rerouting us. So we probably need this to actually return something. So let's change this to actually return something. And let's just have it return an empty React object. And we need this to close. Let's see if that works better for logging out. Let's log back in and then log back out and see if that's cleaner. Let's log in to Shay's app. Log in. Log in here. Okay. I wonder why that still says false. And then let's log out and see if. Okay, better. So we need log out to look like this in our instructions. This is what logout looks like. Okay, so one of the rules here is that this render function for the route either has to redirect the user or return a component to render. And we just decided to make it render an empty component because it's manipulating history anyway. So we have the user logging in and logging out. We should be able to tell whether or not the user is logging in or logging out. For instance, we can kind of come back to your sign in. What's it called? Sign in component. Let's not find your sign in component.
Pages.
What's it called?
Sign in. Oh, it's sign in.
Index. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So probably what we'll end up doing here is something like changing this to because we're going to let auth0 eventually deal with all of this. And this will be to /login. And we don't need an on click here. All right, it'll probably be something like this, where you're going to have a login button that will just take somebody to the login and log in with Google, bounce us around, and end up back on the homepage. Now, if we don't want to end up on the homepage, what we can do is in the auth, in the handle, where is it, handle authentication, right? If you want the person to end up somewhere when they log in, where do you want them to be when they log in? Maybe on /profile?
Yes. Sorry, I was kind of distracted by because some of the code shouldn't go away.
Which code should not go away?
Like where it's like help inspire.
Oh yeah, I'm just doing, just trying to show someone like, yeah, hey, what you want is just a button that just goes to the login page, yeah, right? So just about everybody has someplace in their app where they designed, hey, log in. You're not going to be collecting username and password or giving them 6 options to click on there. That's what we're going to ask auth0 to do. So it's in your design. You just want to replace all the things that have prompts for usernames and passwords and whatnot with just a button that says log into my application, and auth0 will do all of that for you. If we want, after the user logs in, we can send the user to the profile page, I think by coming into handle authentication and putting them here. And if logout should take them to the sign in component, we can do this. So let's see what happens if we log out now.
You spelled sign in wrong.
All right, let's log out. And now let's click on submit and log in and see if we end up on the profile page. Let's log in with Google from my personal Google. And we end up on the profile page. Right. And then if we have a logout somewhere, do you have a logout link or anything? Yeah, if we had a logout, just make that a link to /logout, and that will log the user out. Cool. So that's our login, our logout, and our routing. We can get more complicated in the profile. Nope, not printing there.
Have like a sign in at the very bottom. You can make a logout.
Yeah. In your profile component, you could, in the component will mount, you could do something like if not auth is authenticated. Right. You could say history replace sign in. You could do something like this. Right? So say if the user is not authenticated, whoosh, send them somewhere else and don't let them get at this page. Right? I don't know if your apps are like that, where you don't want them to be able to get into the app unless they're signed in, but this is how you would do this. The idea of like this guard clause. We'd have to do the same thing here. Let's see if this works. We'd have to import auth and history again. So these 3 boilerplate lines.
Do you still make a new auth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every component's going to have its own auth. Now you have yours in subdirectory, so we have to do ... to get at them, because you have yours arranged into subdirectories.
Might need to be done twice.
Yeah, it looks like two levels down. So auth, your main directory is up here. This is just because of the way you have it organized. So let's log out, and let's try and go to /profile. Right. Now I can only go to the profile page if I'm an authenticated user. Right. Every time I try and go to profile, boom, it kicks me back to the sign-in page without any rendering of this. Right. So this little guard clause here, if that's what you intended to do. So let's just log in one more time, so we're logged in, and see that that works. Yes, as me. And here's my profile page. Here's the profile page. Cool. All right, now we can use login and logout routes to allow the user to log in and log out. Additionally, we can check if the user is authenticated and redirect them to the login page if we need to, just like we did in the profile page. So let's talk about sending that profile information, that token information to the backend. Because the backend is going to need to know who we are as well. So for instance, anywhere in our app where we have code that looks like this, like Axios get tacos, then response, hey, do something with that response, we need to pass it some information, which means now we have to pass headers. The idea of the headers are additional information that the browser sends to the server. Things like, am I Chrome or Opera or IE? Right, that's a user agent header. The cookies that the browser has, those go along in headers. It's additional information the browser sends to the server. Well, one of the things we need to send is the authorization header that says, this is my access token. Please have a copy of my access token backend so you know who I am as well. So let's find a spot in Shay's profile component where he is using Axios. He's doing this in his data store, I think. Here's his component will mount. We didn't have one.
What are you trying to do?
Where does that load the...
Oh, from Axios calls?
Yes.
I
think it's in your
pages and then my data store. I'm using MobX. That's where I'm doing most of my
yes.
data calls right now.
My data store. So somewhere in here, aha, so here's the get profile data, right? Axios get profiles 1, then response.
Did you just click on a...
I did. You can hold down command and click on the variable to see where it's defined. Right? And I hold down command and I clicked on this function and I went to it.
Wow, okay. That's what's
Yeah.
up.
Nice, huh? Did I just change your world?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. I think I can click on most things, right? Look, there's Axios if you want to dig into like the Axios code. Yay. Right? So what we want is, we want to change this get profile data to also have the headers. So the second thing that Axios sends is the params. The third thing it sends is an object of the headers. So let's grab these headers. And let's add them in here. But now I also need the auth component, right? Because I'm asking the auth for its authorization headers, which means now in my data store, I need to import auth. Let's just copy the boilerplate to make sure I did it right. We need this boilerplate again. And I think I'm going to swap these around. The boilerplate, where is it? I'm going to swap this around. Because it's all I really need are these 2 lines. let's import the auth here, so we have it. And now, data store is up one directory to here, 2 directories. So it's up 2 directories is where we have auth. Excellent. Now we're sending headers to our app, and then we're telling our backend, hey, this is the authorization header that I got from auth0. This is who I am. We're sending that to the server now. We probably, or maybe we will see this in our Rails server. I don't know if we will. Here are these are your images loading. Yeah, it doesn't look like we do. Yeah, it doesn't show you the headers, unfortunately. So if this is how we're sending the information to the server, let's figure out, where is it? Let's talk about adding to the back end information to be able to pull that profile information on the back end. There's a note in here, and I haven't tried this yet. Maybe we'll try it in Shay's app here in a minute. That if you're consistently using Axios for web requests, I think we can put this in our app component. And what it'll do is it'll tell every Axios call to use that header. So you don't have to go to every single Axios call and try it. So we'll try this after we see if we get the basics working. So this is, add it in one place, and every Axios call doesn't have to be modified, because you may end up with a bunch in your code and you don't have to chase them all around. But we'll try this in a minute. So in our Rails application now, we're going to flip over to that side and figure out how we start configuring our Rails application to know who we are when we log in. So in our Rails application, we need a way to access the currently active user. I think you called it a profile. Other people called it profiles. Some people called it users or drivers or whatever it happens to be. We're going to do this by adding a private method to the application controller that fetches the currently authenticated user. Right? Note in the instructions below, if you called your thing user, you called it profile, just use that in place where you see user.
What's the purpose of the private method?
It makes it so that it used to be in Rails, any public controller method was accessible as a URL, as a route. So we were always very careful to put these kind of helper methods as private methods, and it's just a continuation from that. Things in your controllers that are not providing data to, like not rendering JSON or rendering HTML, should be private. That way they don't accidentally show up as, we don't want /current user to be a route accidentally. So if we make them private, we know then that we don't have, we don't accidentally expose this code to the web, right? Because this is helper code. So in our app controller's application controller, we want something like this. Let's copy this code and go put it in your application controller. Aha. So Shay had already created, I think you and I had created this idea of a current profile method. Well, he called his profile, so we're not gonna have this profile find one. We're gonna change this to current profile instead of current user. We're gonna change user to profile. So the idea here is that we're gonna get that authorization header that the client was just sending us. We're gonna split it on space and get the last element, because that's the format of that authorization header, and that's gonna be our token. If you remember back the idea of that token, and Mark showed that JWT token, and it's got 3 parts, and blah, 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 and it's got all this data encoded in it. That's what we're passing back and forth. And that's what we're fetching out of the headers here. that token, right, the example of the bank, the person's app in the bank, and to get their bank details, that token goes back and forth. That's what we're fetching here, right? And that is what we were just working with. We're sending here, right? We're sending this authorization header from the client, and we're getting it back on the server. So now the server has access to it. Got a question, Toby?
If you have other models that belong to profile, do you need to add this to those, or are they
No.
covered?
So this is not in the model. You'll notice that this is in the controller.
Or other, I'm saying other models, oh yeah.
So this controller, this method, current profile, we can now call in any of our controllers to find out who's the current person logged in. Right? So when we go look at Shay's code, we'll see that he's not fetching all of the posts. He's saying current profile dot posts, only the posts for the current profile, right? In this case, that profile is this one, right? So the rest of this code just decodes that token, and then we're going to add eventually a method to our profile data model to give me back the profile from the authorization hash. So we're taking that token, we're decoding it, and then we're going to go look to see, do we have a record for this profile anywhere? Do we know this person? In order to do that, we need another couple bits of code. We need that auth from hash method, right? The code needs our user, or in this case, profile class, to be able to find or create that user/profile, right? The very first time someone comes to your app, they don't have a profile record in your database. Right? We need the ability to find that person in the database. If they're not there, we want to create them. So in our user, in this case, profile active record class, we're going to add the following code. Right? It says note that inside the do block here, this do block right here, is where we would capture any user-specific information, such as avatar, name, email, etc. So this payload is going to have a bunch of information in it. We can pull that information out and store it in our database. So if you were like, I need to know the person's email, or I want their profile picture, this is the point we're going to grab that out of their profile and throw it in the database. So let's play with that real quick. Let's grab this code, and let's put it in Shay's profile.rb. So we're going to add this code here. Instead of user, profile. So you'll notice that it's calling this method find or create by, and we're passing it this auth sub. Right? That's that sub element that we talked about in that JWT token. It's the subscription. It's who is this person, right? It's like their Google ID or their GitHub ID, etc. This is the thing that uniquely identifies them. What we're going to say is, go and try and find a profile based on that column. We don't have that column, so we're going to need to run a migration to add it. While we're here, let's make this profile updated for our purposes, right? We're not calling it user. Shay called his profile. If you called yours user, then there's nothing to change. If not, just change the words. So I think, let's go quickly look at Shay's schema. Let's go look at his profile table. Profiles. So you have name, about me, and quote, but we don't have an avatar URL, but I think you have an attached image.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So let's do this for now. Let's only, wait for the police to go by. Let's not deal with the avatar URL just yet, because what auth0 is going to give us back is not their image, but the URL to where their profile image lives on the internet. So we'll deal with that in a minute. But at least now let's just grab their name, right, out of the profile. And the other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to do a pretty print. This is the profile. And let's just pretty print the profile information. But I said we're going to try and find this profile by their auth sub. Well, we don't have an auth sub here in the profile, so let's add that. Let's run a migration. Add auth sub to profile. Auth sub, and I don't know how large it is, so I'm just going to make it text in case it's really, really large. Right, so we're going to add this auth sub field to the profile. That's how we're going to do the lookup. Right? We don't know which ID we are. It might be two people with the same name. There might be two people with the same email address. Right? But there's never two people with the same authorization subscription sub.
Can you dump that command in Slack?
This Rails generate migration. I'm also going to add it to the no, we may also need this auth sub column on our user or profile or etc. model. So let's add this here. Let's dump this in Slack. And just for the notes, I'm going to call this user. So let's go make sure that add a column to profiles called auth sub that's text. That looks good. Let's run the migrations and then restart the server. Rails DB migrate. I am tired today. Rails server. Okay. So now we have the ability to find or create this user by this sub. Let's do this. We need one more bit of code. Because the other thing that this code did is use this JSON web token class. We need to add that. That does not come by default. So out of the boilerplate, let's grab this. This JSON web token file goes in lib JSON web token. So in our lib, we will make a new file called JSON web token.rb, and we will paste this code. Okay. This code just decodes that authentication token. Note that we have to change this our app to the name of the app you created. In my case, it is gstark. Right, it'll be whatever your auth0 account domain is. And that's, I think, all we need to add. Now, if we log out, no access token found. Why did we get no access token found?
Are you running the server?
Let's see, I think I am here and I am here. Get access token is being called from here, which is being called from here. Oh, because your data store is calling this all the time? Yes, because your app is calling get profile data, but we only want to do this if the authorization is authenticated. Do you want to do this? Right, it doesn't make sense to get the profile data or tags if they're not authenticated. Right, so anytime we're using this, my data store, get profile data, we have to make sure we're authenticated because otherwise it won't know who we are. Cool. That's particular to his application. Well, let's do this. Let's go into your console and see what profiles we have. What's going on? Oh, goodness. Oh, bother. I did an upgrade this morning, and something is broken. This is a Gavin computer fault. I want to do it a different way. Let's go look at all the profiles that you have. Right. So there's a profile here, Gavin. There's a profile here named Shay. There's a profile, there's a second Gavin, and a Jason. Do you have Awesome Print installed?
Think so.
We don't. Okay. So there's no Gavin Stark here, which would be my profile name from Google. We could also, let's do this. Let's just delete all the profiles that are in there. Let's not do that. Let's not do that, just in case we break something. So there's profile up to 6. Now, if we've done this correctly, if I log in, we should bounce over to auth0, log in with Google, ask me which account, should send me back to your app. Aha. And now we should see, do we have one more user? We do not. Profiles.
Are you sure that wasn't a new Gavin?
No, it would have my full name, not just Gavin, because my full name on Google is Gavin Stark. So I would see a full Gavin Stark. So let's see if we can figure out what's going on. So what we expected to have happen was when your app asked for the current profile, let's look at your profiles controller. Aha. Okay. So your profiles controller is not asking for the current person. So your profiles 1, your profile code is looking for API profiles 1. So let's see why that is happening. So I think what's happening in your code.
I'm searching by ID for the profile.
Yes, and we don't know the ID. So in your data store, your get profile data now just needs to ask for the current profile. So what we can say here is API profiles 1. Let's look at your routes. Yeah, so your API profiles ID is calling API profiles show. What we want now is we want a way to show the current. So let's ask for the current profile, right? /profile should just show the current profile. We'll have a different component or a different way of getting this to show a specific profile. So we want our get profile data to ask for API profiles current. Then in our routes, we can now say get API profiles current to API profiles current. Right? Otherwise, if we don't have something, if we don't see current, then it'll go to show. Now your profiles controller will be much the same. We'll have a current method, and then rather than find the profile will be equal to the current profile. And all the rest of this code will be the same. All the rest of this code down to here will be the same. And we'll deal with that sameness in a minute. So now your data store or your Axios call is asking not just for a specific profile, but give me the current profile. The routes has a route for API profiles current, goes to the API profiles controller current method. It asks for the current profile, and then from that asks for the authorized posts and post, etc. Right? So now I think if we reload this,
I think you still have just like slash profile.
let me see, I think I may have to reload. Maybe I didn't restart the server. And reload. It's getting an error in the application controller line 8. Let's take a look at application controller line 8. JWT. Ah, I think we missed a step. I think we missed a step. Did we miss a step? There's a gem we have to add. Bundle add. Yes, I think we missed a step. That is bundle add Rails JWT. It's just JWT. Yes, I think we were missing a step. JWT, Rails server. Let's see if we are missing that step. And not your GitHub page, reload this page. Okay, so let's see, did our profile get created? No. We did not get a profile created. So let's see if we can figure this out. Oh, no, now we have a different error. Doesn't know what JSON web token is. But we should have that. Right. This JSON web token is the same thing as this JSON web token. We shouldn't have to do this. Let's see. Reload the page. Do we still have an error? Aha, okay. So next thing to update the instructions with is we need this at the top of, I'll just put it there so we find it at the same spot. Where did we put that? We put that right here. JSON web token. JSON web token. Okay. So that fixes that problem. Now it says it doesn't know authorized post for nil in our profiles controller. So in our profiles controller, it's saying this is nil. It didn't create the current profile. So let's go take a look at the current profile method. Application controller. So that should have called profile from hash, from auth hash. If you look in our profile, from auth hash, find or create by. Aha. Let's look at your profile. You have no validations. And let's put some debugging in here. Rails logger debug. Payload. Let's log that payload and see if we're even getting here, right? The profiles controller should be asking for the current profile, and the purpose of the current profile in the application controller is to do this. if we're not getting an error here. We might be getting an error here. So before we do that, let's see if we're getting an error here. Let's just Rails logger debug the request headers authorization.
Is that like console log?
It is. Yeah, Rails logger info, Rails logger debug is like console log, but for Rails. So what we should get is we should see that authorization header when we load this. Let's see if we get that. We don't. We don't. Rails logger debug. Authorization header. We should see that logged in the server logs if we're getting the current profile. Every time we ask for the current profile, it should show us this. And then okay, we got the authorization header. Let's just log the headers and see what we get. So we can log the headers and make this request. And great. It's opaque. We can't see what's inside. So it's saying we should get this authorization header. Let's look to see if we're sending it. So in the browser, what we should see in the network, when we make this request for the profile, let's see if we're sending that header. So here's that profile request. Here's the response headers. Where are the request headers? Aha! We're not sending the request headers. They're not coming through.
How can you tell it's not going through?
Because I would see something that says authorization here. I see accept encoding, cache, connection, cookie, host. We added another header. Remember when I said like one of the headers that goes through is which browser are you? We added in your code when we send the profile, one of the headers should be authorization. So we're not sending it. So that's in your data store. Oh wait, it's this one. My bad. I'm looking at the wrong one. That's the one to get your profile. Let's see it's in here. Request headers. It's not here either. Accept so-and-so, but we don't see authorization. So let's not futz around with it. Let's see if we can do the thing where we set the default headers. Right, you said we were going to try that. Let's try it now anyway. Let's go back to this. And in your app.js, let's try that snippet that like globally configures. That globally configures Axios. That might be easier. All right, I said in here, there's a little bit of code that supposedly globally configures Axios. Let's try that. And let's reload this page. So here's current. Where's current? Current. And let's see if that header is going now. Yep, there's the authorization header. There's the authorization header. So this is easier. This is going to be easier than running around and doing all of the Axios calls. This should just add it to everything. So now here's our header and our bearer. It still doesn't know who we are. So now what we want to figure out is in the profile, we're not getting this is the profile, right? We don't see this is the profile anywhere here when we're asking for this information. Right, we have the authorization header and that funny number. And now what we want to look at is are we getting an error? Let's see if we're getting an error from the JWT. We are. We're getting an error. So what error are we getting? We're getting an error. Debugging. Not enough or too many segments. Not enough or too many segments. Yeah, because that authorization header is pretty short. Let's go back and look at the auth.js. Hey, where's the handle authentication? So what it's saying is that the information we're passing in doesn't have all the things that we need. So we are setting that session, and that's putting the access token there. And that's sending the access token. Something in this is not correct. We're storing the access token, and that's what we're sending when we get the authorization header. We're getting the access token, and that's referencing the access token. The access token. And that's what's being stored from the access token. It's also the ID token. But maybe that's not what we're supposed to send. Okay, so something in what we're sending is not correct. What we're sending is not correct. This is now correct. But what we're sending in this authorization from the client to the server is not correct. So that when this tries to get decoded, so we can figure out who this is, so we can look them up in the database, that's not correct. Everything else so far is good. I think once we have that, our current user, in this case current profile, will be correct, so that when we go to our profiles controller, we can start asking for that current profile. So we can take a break and see if we can see if I can figure this out on the break. But what we should be able to do is once we have this current user or current profile, all of the relationships that we have, right? .trips or, right, all of your profile information and your links or your albums, right, or your posts, we should be able to get them from that current profile. Right? So you already, if you have all your relations set up to this profile, right, then we can just ask that profile for their posts, their authorized posts, or their regular posts, or their trips, or whatever they are. The challenge is in getting this current profile to return the correct person, right? That auth0 authorized them, has this token, it's supposed to pass us the token, and we should be able to get that information back. But something is broken. I believe now what we have so far in the instructions are correct up to not being able to get the current profile or the current user correctly. So let me take a break and then we'll figure out what's going on with that. And once I figure out what's going on with it, then we'll get back together and we'll finish this so you can see how the current user, current profile works. And then we'll talk about in the profile code how to handle the avatar URL or the name or any of the extra information you want to get and save for them. Because I think once we have that figured out, then everything else will be connected and we'll be okay. So let's plan like a 10 or 15, and if I don't have it figured out, then we'll just meet back up after lunchtime and we'll finish this up. Or maybe we'll do it at 3.